Well, good morning to you all. We continue this morning our journey through the Gospel of Mark, and we are still in chapter 1. We have been in chapter 1 for quite a little while, but there is a lot to cover in chapter 1. Last week, Pastor Glenn led us through really a day in the life of the earthly ministry of Jesus, and it was a busy day. In the morning, Jesus was teaching, and he taught like no other rabbi the people had ever heard before. His teaching was marked by his authority, and the crowds were amazed as they sat before his teaching. Well, they stood before his teaching. Everyone was amazed. And then he ordered an evil spirit out of a man. And again, everyone was amazed, and news about him spread rapidly. Jesus then left the synagogue. He headed to the home of Simon and Andrew, where he healed Simon's mother-in-law, who had been unwell. Evening came, but still there was no rest for Jesus. The sun had gone down, but a crowd, in fact, the whole town, had gathered outside of the door of Simon and Andrew's house. And so Jesus spent the evening healing the townsfolk of all kinds of diseases and driving out from them many demons. Now, we don't know what time Jesus got to bed on that particular night, but I assume it was not a particularly early night, because that whole healing and casting out of demons party didn't really get going until after dark. It was a long and a demanding day for Jesus, and no doubt all of the great needs of the people and the physical limitations of a human body had taken their toll on him. And yet we are told in verse 35 that very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up and he left the house and he went out to a solitary or a desolate place where he prayed. As tired and as emotionally drained as he might have been from a full day of teaching and dealing with human sickness and dealing with the forces of evil head on, Jesus makes it his priority to rise not just early in the morning, not just very early in the morning, but very early while it was still dark, to go out to that solitary place where he could spend time alone with the Father. Now, I want us to just pause there for a moment and to stop and to put ourselves in this picture. Put yourself in the scene from the night before. The whole town is gathered outside someone's door, and one after another, Jesus is miraculously healing people of sicknesses, some of which would no doubt have been with them for much of their lives. And one after the other, he's driving demons out of people and restoring them to full health and full freedom. That atmosphere must have been electric. You can imagine if we witnessed one person being miraculously healed, what sort of an atmosphere that would create. People would be running off and telling everyone. But here is a whole town, and he's healing all of their diseases and driving demons from those who've been oppressed by them. So it doesn't take a genius to work out what's going to happen the next day. If the whole town were on his doorstep that evening, the whole town and then some more are going to be there the next day. And how easy it would have been for Jesus just to have woken up on that morning and enjoyed the adulation of the crowd. How easy it would have been for him to just keep on doing what he was doing, keep on healing, and keep on casting out demons. It was, after all, a ministry of compassion. It was a ministry of healing. It was helping people and doing them good. And it was drawing a crowd to himself, which you can imagine is what you want to happen if you're trying to get a message out there. Yet just when his healing ministry is really starting to take off, Jesus withdraws from the crowds and he heads out to a lonely place to pray. Now Simon and the others, they go off to look for him, and the fact that they find him suggests what Luke's gospel makes explicit, that this was a regular practice of Jesus to go off out into lonely places to pray. So their finding him was probably only a matter of checking the various places that he was known to go to. Stating the obvious, when they find him, they exclaim, "Everyone is looking for you." Now, we can imagine what they were hoping to achieve by that statement. Most likely they wanted to bring the headline act back into town for an encore performance. But Jesus has got other ideas. He says to them, "Let's go somewhere else, to the nearby villages, so that I can preach there also. That is why I have come." Now these 4 little verses are packed with so much that we can learn about Jesus and apply to our own lives. Human beings would have stayed with the crowd. There's little doubt about that. The crowd are no doubt ecstatic. Clearly they couldn't get enough of Jesus because they were back the next day looking for him. They would have been singing his praises, not literally, but they would have had plenty to say about what a great thing he'd done to their grandma or their friend or the neighbour who lived down the street. They would have been telling anyone who would listen how great he was. And if we are not careful, it is very easy for us mere mortals to get caught up in that, to enjoy the praise of others, and in fact to crave the praise of others, so much so that it becomes the motivating force behind many of our actions. But for Jesus, the miracles were not why he came. His miracles, as we've seen last week and in previous weeks, they served to authenticate his message. But he would not allow them to overshadow his mission. This time alone with God allowed not only for him to connect with the source of his authority and power, but they helped him to keep his mission front and centre, and to prevent it being crowded out by the many competing interests. And in our lives, there is no end of competing interests vying for our attention and for our time. And it is easy, very easy, to get carried away with those ones that appear most urgent, or that bring us most joy, or that bring us most praise, or maybe even just those that we find easiest. And this discipline of regular time alone with God that Jesus has modelled for us here in this passage, that is how we keep the main thing in our lives. Capernaum at this point in time was a place of adulation for Jesus. Things were going well there, and it would have been easy for him to just stay there and keep on pleasing the crowds. And how much more so for us? We all enjoy the praise of others and the comfort of the familiar. It is easy for us to get stuck there. But beware, because pride lurks in our Capernaum, waiting for its opportunity to strut its stuff in that moment when we lose sight of the source of all good gifts and of all power in our lives. So this discipline of regular time alone with God helps us to keep things in perspective, helps us to recognise and reconnect with the source of power in our lives, and it helps us mere mortals to keep our ambitions in check, to rein in our egos, and to temper pride with a healthy dose of humility. It helps us keep the main thing the main thing. Let's go somewhere else to the nearby villages so that I can preach there also. That is why I have come, says Jesus. And so we see here in this example that when prayer and solitude, time alone with God, is prioritised, the natural outworking of that in our lives will be that mission also is prioritised. And if you think about it, how could it not be? When we spend time alone with God, increasingly we will tune our will to His. And increasingly we will want for this world what He wants for this world. And that will become the driving force behind our actions, and it will become easier and easier to pass up on all of these other things that threaten to close in on us. So really this morning, we're not just talking about the priority of prayer, we're talking about the priority of prayer and mission, because the two of them are interlinked. They go hand in hand. That's what this passage is showing us, which is why the health of our prayer lives, both individually and as a church together, will always be my highest priority as a pastor. Because a church that is not praying together can easily lose sight of its mission and expend inordinate amounts of time and energy on all sorts of activities that will draw a crowd, that will make a church appear popular, that might even send people home energised and excited, but that will completely miss the mark when it comes to mission. So Jesus regularly practiced this discipline of solitude, time alone with God in prayer, and so should we, for all sorts of reasons, but including the one that is modelled here, when Jesus arose from his time of prayer with a single-minded focus on his mission. Now, like all of you, I presume, or most of you, we at home share a fence line with our neighbours. Both of us on either side of the fence have been there for quite some time now, but sadly, before either one of us moved in, someone in their wisdom, on one or both sides of the fence, we don't know, decided to plant Jasmine along the fence line. Not star jasmine, the sort of manageable, nice jasmine that stays where you put it, but the weedy, vigorous, twining, clumping, light-blocking, climbing up and strangling your trees kind of jasmine that forms a great big mat across the top level of all your shrubs and trees and completely blocks out the light and prevents them from growing. And so for the last 20 years or so, both of us on either side of the fence line have been battling the consequences of somebody's horticultural blunder. And every 2 or 3 years the situation gets so bad, with the canopy of jasmine just covering everything, that I take it upon myself to balance precariously on the top rung of our fence, with one foot on the top rung and the other foot in the neighbours' trees, with the secateurs in my hand, trying to cut and pull down all the masses of what's grown up in the trees. And we then spend the next 3 or 4 weeks trying to dispose of the huge volume of stuff that we bring down. We call it the war on jasmine. And one year determined that this would be my last year of doing this fence balancing act, because as I get older it gets more and more likely that that's going to end in disaster. And I decided to take matters into my own hands while the next door neighbours were on holidays overseas. So I spent the best part of a day pulling out every bit of jasmine that I could find from both sides of the fence. And I was very pleased with my efforts, and so were they when they came back from holidays, for about 6 or 8 weeks, until those little twining stems started to appear again and wind their way around everything. You see, unless you can get all of the roots and all of the little broken bits of stem of jasmine out, it is only a matter of time before it will be back. Even your very best efforts will only be a band-aid solution. Now, we live with the consequences of a fallen world. We live with sickness and with evil and with death all around us. You only have to look at the news to see that. And these things affect us all in one way or another. These miracles that Jesus was doing, they brought relief to the people. And no doubt they brought great joy to those who were healed or to those he had cast out demons from. But today's desperate crowd would always be replaced tomorrow by another desperate crowd, and then the next day another desperate crowd after that. Jesus did not come to stick band-aids on our human problems. He came to deal with the cause, sin, at its root. And so he moved on from Capernaum, and at this point, so must we. We come to verse 40 and a story about a leper. And its inclusion in Mark's Gospel at this point is curious for a number of reasons. First of all, we know that this Gospel writer Mark is a man of few words. He has already told us in his typically succinct style in verse 34 that Jesus healed many who had various diseases. That was his summary statement about the situation. Jesus healed many who had various diseases. You can imagine what that sentence, the reality of that sentence actually looks like. Many who had various diseases. That sentence no doubt contains many, many wonderful stories. What then could be so special about this one leper who was healed that would warrant such special attention from this gospel writer? Well, a little bit of background before we move on. The word leprosy in the Bible it's a broad term that refers to a number of infectious skin conditions. Leprosy is one of them, but it is the most likely one by far that this passage is talking about. It begins with discoloured patches on the skin, red or pale patches, and they are typically numb to the touch. Now Luke, who was a physician, who also wrote a gospel, he describes this man's condition as being covered with leprosy. So his condition is well advanced. So we're not talking about a few red patches on his skin here. As leprosy advances, the nerve endings become dead, and this is most pronounced at the extremities: hands, feet, nose, fingers and toes. When your nerve endings are dead like that, they aren't susceptible to pain. And so you become more susceptible to being injured at those points because you can't feel when you're hurting yourself. And when that happens, secondary infections are likely to occur at those injured sites. And it is those secondary infections that result in the tissue loss and the deformities that we think of when we think of leprosy. The disease itself does not make your fingers and toes drop off, but the secondary infections that come in as a result of the injuries that you will do to yourself, they do cause those deformities. And this is likely the state that this man was in, that we're talking about in this passage. This is the state that he was in when Jesus comes to town and he seizes the opportunity to do something that to us seems strange, but in those days would have been absolutely shocking. So we'll deal with the strange first and then we'll get on to the shocking. If you or I had a horrible skin condition and we knew that Jesus was coming to town and we were able to get close enough to Jesus to shout something out to him, what would you be shouting out? Most of us, I think, would be shouting out, "Heal me," or "Make me better," or even "Have mercy on me, heal me, cure me, do something about this dreadful condition that I'm in." This man demands nothing of Jesus. He simply makes a statement. If you will, or if you are willing, you can make me clean. And that one word there, clean, tells us everything that we need to know about the state of someone with leprosy at that time. Someone with leprosy in the first century was not just considered ill. They were considered unclean. In fact, in terms of levels of defilement, sort of under the law, coming near to or touching someone with leprosy was second only to touching a corpse. Leprosy in the Bible is not spoken of as being cured. It is spoken of as being cleansed. And so many people at that time regarded it as a punishment for sin. And the Old Testament law contained extensive guidelines for dealing with leprosy. Essentially, what they amount to is a very extreme form of social distancing. And they served the same purpose. The affected person would be sent outside the camp or outside the city to live, and they would live there alone or with the other lepers, and they were required to keep their distance from everyone. They would wear clothing that was torn. Their hair would become dishevelled and unkempt, and they had to cry out to anyone who was approaching them, "Unclean! Unclean!" to warn those people to stay away so they didn't catch the disease and so they didn't accidentally defile themselves. And that brings us to the shocking part of this man's actions. Instead of keeping his distance and warning those who were approaching or coming near him, this man actually approaches Jesus as he is moving somewhere on his travels throughout Galilee. That would have been, to the people of the time, absolutely shocking. But the shock factor in what he did will pale into insignificance compared with the shock factor of what Jesus does next. Moved with pity, he stretched out his hand and he touched him. Now note the order in which things happen here, because it's important. Jesus does not cleanse this man and then touch him. He reaches out to him where he is, in the state he's in his defilement, and he touches him. And then he says, "I will," or "I'm willing, be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him and he was cured. He stretched out his hand, reached into the situation that he was in the state he was in, and then he cleansed him. Does that remind you of anything? Here is a man whose skin condition rendered him sinful in the eyes of everyone, including himself. Now, whether that verdict was correct or not, we do not know. Nonetheless, that was society's view of him. He lived in that pitiful state, cast outside the camp. But recognising the authority of this man Jesus, he approaches him confident that Jesus can make him clean. And Jesus looks upon his helpless state and he makes him clean. Coming back to the question I asked earlier, why has Mark chosen to include the details of this one particular healing incident when he brushed over so many others in a little summary statement? I think it's because this particular healing speaks to us of our own condition, and it provides for us a snapshot of God's kingdom that is rich, theologically rich. Our state was like that of the leper, unclean before God and outside of his kingdom, until Jesus wandered into our part of Galilee, Galilee of the Gentiles, to deal with sin, the root of our problems. And Jesus, filled with compassion, looked upon us while we were still sinners, and he said, "I am willing, be clean." And he continued his journey to the cross for us. Now, this leper knew his lot in life. Everyone around him knew what his lot in life was. Stay away from everyone, wait outside the camp until the time of ceremonial cleansing, when the priest would go and visit outside the camp and examine him. If his symptoms had cleared, only the priest could declare him clean. And there was a whole process that the two of them, the priest and the one seeking cleansing, had to go through in order for that to be done for him. You will find all of that detail in Leviticus 14. And I urge you to go home today and to read through Leviticus 14 slowly and carefully, and then read through this little short section, this story about this leper, so that you can fully appreciate what is going on here. And you will see that the vivid detail in this very simple story will just be magnified so much by that reading of Leviticus 14. So, Leviticus 14 deals in its entirety with what must happen for a person to be cleansed from an infectious skin condition. I've put a small section from that chapter up on the screen up there. You only have to cast your eye over it to see that it is littered with words like cleansed, cleansing, uncleanness, clean, sin, atonement. There are several offerings mentioned. Two of them that are mentioned are a guilt offering and a sin offering. So if you were suspicious of me presenting this story about our leper as more than just one of many healings that Jesus performed, I present to you Leviticus 14 as Exhibit A, that links the cleansing of ancient skin conditions with atonement and with sin and with guilt. But the most beautiful thing that I want to highlight to you from Leviticus 14 is the picture that it paints for us of what Jesus has done for us. And it comes right at the beginning of that chapter in verses 3 to 7. In Old Testament times, for a person to be cleansed of a skin disease, the priest would order that 2 live birds be brought. One of those birds would be killed over a clay pot full of water. And the second bird would be dipped into the blood of the first that was sacrificed. The priest would then sprinkle the person to be cleansed 7 times and would take the bird that had been dipped out into the wild and release it covered in the blood of the sacrifice. Did you get that bit? One bird is sacrificed, the other covered in the blood of the one that was killed goes free. This passage about this leper is theologically rich. It gives us a snapshot of the kingdom of God. It's got atonement, it's got sacrifice, it's got substitution. But if you take nothing else away from it this morning, take that image of the bird covered in the blood of the sacrifice being released to freedom. Well, recognising in Jesus one with authority to fulfil the law and to deal with the root cause of his problem, our leper approaches. Jesus, moved with compassion, reaches out and then makes him clean. Then look what happens to the leper and to Jesus. Jesus instructs the leper to go and show himself to the priest and to offer the necessary sacrifices under the law. And he tells him specifically then not to tell anyone what had happened. Having left all that hullabaloo of the late night healings outside Simon and Andrew's house, Jesus does not want his mission at this point to be overshadowed by crowds demanding a spectacle. What does the man do? He goes out and he does exactly the opposite of what Jesus told him to do. He blabs to anyone and everyone who will listen. And really, which of us could blame him? If you had been struck down and inflicted with what he had been inflicted by, and you had in an instant been healed, cleansed and found freedom, wouldn't you find it hard to keep your mouth shut about it? And so I want us to close looking at the final scene of this passage, where we find the leper who had been excluded and on the outside of the camp. He is now inside. But where is Jesus? Symbolically here, Jesus, who was on the inside, teaching in the synagogues, visiting people's houses, he is now outside in the desolate places because of the crowds. There's that theme of substitution again for us, linking this passage back to Leviticus. This then is a very powerful snapshot of the kingdom of God. And I believe that it is there because we are meant to see ourselves in this picture. Now, since there are only two characters in this story, one of them's Jesus and we ain't Jesus. If this story were made into one of those photo boards where you stick your head through, it is very obvious which hole we are supposed to stick our heads through. The leper's state is our state. We are outside and excluded from the kingdom of God because of our uncleanliness before God until we come to Jesus. So we can learn from this leper who didn't blame God for his condition, who didn't blame anyone else for his condition, and who did not demand from him healing, but instead recognising his own condition and recognising the authority of Jesus, he fell humbly to his knees before him and said, "If you will, you can make me clean." And so if you're here today and you haven't done that, I urge you to make today your day to fly free. We are going to sing our response this morning to all that Jesus has done for us, all that is detailed in this passage or alluded to in this passage. We're going to sing our closing song as a prayerful response to Jesus. Would you stand? We're going to sing "My worth is not in what I own."